In September 1914, one German general made a decision that saved Paris and doomed millions. He thought he was winning the war in a single stroke. Instead, he created the deadliest mistake in military history. Here's how a taxi fleet changed the course of World War I forever. But first, let me take you back to how we got to this moment. In the final, sweltering days of August 1914, victory for the German Empire seemed not just possible, but inevitable. Its grey-clad legions were a thunderous, unstoppable machine grinding France to dust, and Paris, the glittering prize, was just days from its grasp. This was the culmination of a plan decades in the making, the physical manifestation of a military philosophy that worshipped at the altar of the offensive. It was a single, decisive hammer blow designed to shatter a nation before it could even raise its fists. For the soldiers of France and their British allies, the world had been reduced to a primal, agonizing rhythm. The tramp of worn out boots on dusty roads, the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs, and the constant sound of the guns behind them, a terrifying heartbeat that was always getting closer. This was the Great Retreat, and for the men caught within it, it felt like the end of the world. For weeks, they had done nothing but march backwards, trading precious French soil for a handful of hours they couldn't seem to use. The German army, a monstrous entity of over 1 million men, had scythed through the neutrality of Belgium, swatting aside its legendary forts as if they were children's toys, and poured into northern France in a vast flood. At its head was the German First Army under the command of the ambitious General von Kluck. He was 68 years old, a veteran of past wars, aggressive and utterly confident in his men and his mission. His soldiers were forged in the crucible of Prussian discipline. They had marched relentlessly under a blistering summer sun, their endless columns kicking up clouds of white dust that could be seen for miles, a chalky haze that seemed to suffocate the very hope out of the French countryside. But here's what they couldn't see: their very success was about to become their downfall. They had pushed the British forces and the French Fifth Army to their absolute breaking point. The British rifle fire was so rapid and accurate the Germans believed they were facing machine guns, but courage alone could not stop the sheer weight of numbers. The entire Allied left wing was not just bending, it was breaking. Entire divisions, which had marched to war with bright flags and confident songs just a month before, were shrinking into haggard remnants. Men were lost to the constant, vicious skirmishes that flared up in every village and forest, to the oppressive heat that baked the roads, and to the sheer, soul-crushing exhaustion of the retreat. Morale was a currency they had almost run out of. Soldiers, caked in sweat and dirt, threw away their heavy packs, their greatcoats, anything to lighten the load as they trudged south, their faces etched with the grim, hollow-eyed certainty of defeat. They saw the faces of their own countrymen, a parallel river of misery, as refugees clogged the roads with farm carts piled high with their worldly possessions. The old, the women, the children, their expressions a silent mirror of the soldiers' own despair. France was bleeding, its northern industrial heartlands captured, its armies in retreat, and the heart of the nation, Paris, was now exposed and vulnerable. The French government, in a move that screamed panic, had already fled the capital for the safety of Bordeaux, a clear signal to the world that they believed the city was lost. In the vibrant, beautiful streets of Paris, a nervous, unnatural quiet had fallen. Cafes that were once filled with laughter and debate now stood half empty. The city that saw itself as the light of civilization was preparing for darkness, for the humiliation of another German occupation, a bitter, painful echo of their defeat 40 years earlier. What happened next changed everything. The German plan, the legendary Schlieffen Plan, was working to perfection. It was a grand, sweeping maneuver, conceived years before by its namesake field marshal, who believed that in a two-front war against both France and Russia, speed was everything. Russia would take weeks to mobilize its full strength. In that window, Germany would deliver a single, overwhelming blow to France. The plan was a right hook of immense power, with the bulk of the German army swinging through Belgium to avoid the heavily fortified French border. It was designed to move west of Paris, a great wheeling scythe that would encircle the entire French army and pin it against its own fortresses in the east. With the French army annihilated, the war in the West would be over in 6 weeks, allowing Germany to turn its full attention to Russia. It was audacious, brilliant, and in these final days of August, it appeared utterly flawless. General von Kluck and his First Army were the outermost edge of this great scythe. His orders were simple: keep moving, keep swinging wide, and do not let the enemy escape the closing trap. Victory was a mathematical certainty. The only question left was when the French would finally accept their fate and surrender. But an army is not a monolith of steel and will. It is a collection of tired, hungry, sweating men. And the German machine, for all its terrifying power, was beginning to show the strain. The soldiers were as exhausted as their opponents, many marching on raw nerves alone. Supply lines, the arteries of any army, were struggling to keep up, stretching thin across hundreds of miles of conquered territory. Ammunition was still plentiful, but food was becoming scarce. More critically, communication between the German armies was failing. Radio signals were weak and often delayed, and commanders were forced to make decisions with incomplete information, relying on their own judgment and ambition. And no commander on the field had more ambition than General von Kluck. He could feel the enemy crumbling before him. He could smell the final victory in the air. He believed the French forces to his direct front were the final obstacle, the last organized force that needed to be shattered. The Schlieffen Plan was a masterpiece on paper, but in the dust and heat of the field, a simpler, more direct solution presented itself. The temptation to deliver the killing blow, right here and now, was becoming overwhelming. It was a temptation that would not only change the course of the battle, but the course of the 20th century. For in the minds of the overconfident, the greatest strength can become the most fatal of weaknesses, and that's exactly what was about to happen. History rarely pivots on a single command, but in the first week of September, von Kluck made a choice that would doom millions. It wasn't born of incompetence or malice, but of something far more dangerous: the unshakable arrogance of impending victory. General von Kluck, commanding the 150,000 men of the German First Army, gazed at his maps, saw the retreating French Fifth Army before him, and made a fateful calculation. He was a soldier of the old Prussian school, aggressive to a fault, a man who believed that the only good defense was a relentless attack. The original Schlieffen Plan called for him to continue his sweep west and south of Paris to complete the vast encirclement of the entire French armed forces. It was a plan built on patience and absolute strategic discipline. But von Kluck, after weeks of victorious pursuit, had little patience left. He was a battlefield predator, and his instincts screamed that his prey was wounded, stumbling, ready for the kill. He had convinced himself, and reported as much to German high command, that the French army was a spent force, its will to fight utterly broken and incapable of any coherent action. To swing wide of Paris now seemed like a foolish waste of time that would allow the remnants of the enemy forces to escape and perhaps rally. He would not allow it. He wanted the glory of the final, decisive blow. On August 31st, he made his decision. Instead of continuing southwest as planned, he ordered his army to turn southeast, a sharp, decisive pivot that would drive him inside of Paris, not around it. His goal was to roll up the French flank, to outrun and crush them in a final, glorious battle of annihilation. In his mind, it was a stroke of battlefield genius, a decisive move to hasten the inevitable and write his name in the history books. But here's what he couldn't see: he had just handed his enemies the perfect opportunity. German high command, located hundreds of miles away in Luxembourg, was commanded by the thoughtful General von Moltke, who lacked the iron certainty of his famous uncle. Von Moltke was increasingly anxious, disconnected from the reality on the front. When von Kluck announced his change of plan, von Moltke was uneasy, but he reluctantly approved the deviation. He too was caught in the grip of victory fever that had swept through Germany. Who was he to question the judgment of his most successful general on the field? They couldn't see what their decision had just created. They couldn't see the catastrophic flaw that had just been introduced into their brilliant war machine. As von Kluck's immense army wheeled to the southeast, it exposed its entire right flank. For days, this flank, tens of thousands of soldiers, their artillery trains, their supply wagons would be marching across the face of Paris, vulnerable and open to any attack that might emerge from the city's garrison. It was a mistake of colossal proportions, a violation of the most basic military principles, akin to a swordsman turning his back on a wounded but still dangerous foe. The commander of the German Second Army, the cautious General von Bülow, grew nervous as he saw the gap between their two armies begin to widen. He requested support from von Kluck, an action that only encouraged von Kluck's turn further to the east, stretching the gap to over 20 miles. This gap was a tear in the fabric of the German advance, a strategic vacuum that was growing by the hour. It was miles of open country, defended by little more than a thin screen of cavalry patrols. If the Allies knew it was there, they could drive a wedge straight through the German line, splitting their most powerful armies and turning the hunters into the hunted. But the Germans were certain the Allies were blind, broken, and incapable of doing anything but running. They were marching towards a ghost, a phantom army they believed existed only to be destroyed, unaware that their own actions were breathing life and purpose back into their foe. Little did they know, one man in Paris was about to turn their confidence into their downfall. The sky itself became the first witness to the German error. High above the marching columns, a French aviator named Louis Breguet squinted down from the open cockpit of his fragile aircraft, the wind whipping at his face. He saw the seemingly endless rivers of grey-clad soldiers, but he saw something else, something that made his heart pound against his ribs. He saw the direction of their march. They were not heading for Paris. They were moving past it, presenting their flank to the city like an engraved invitation. This was the intelligence that would change everything, the spark that would ignite the miracle. As von Kluck's army continued its march, confident and blind, it was marching straight into a trap of its own making. All that was needed was for someone to have the courage and the vision to spring it. While the French government fled and Parisians braced for the inevitable siege, one man refused to accept defeat. From his dusty office in Les Invalides, the city's military governor, General Gallieni, became the nerve center of a desperate nation. Gallieni was 65 years old, a veteran of France's colonial wars, a man whose energy and sharp intellect belied his age. He had been recalled from retirement to defend the capital, a task many considered hopeless. But Gallieni did not deal in hopelessness. His office was a chaotic whirlwind of maps, reports, and frantic adjutants. He was everywhere at once, organizing defenses, calming the public, and piecing together the strategic puzzle. As the reports from his aviators flooded in, confirming the unbelievable news of von Kluck's eastward turn, Gallieni saw the opportunity with the stunning, crystalline clarity of a master chess player. He jabbed a finger at the map, tracing the German line of march. "They offer us their flank," he exclaimed to his stunned staff. It was a gift from the gods of war, a blunder so profound it could only be born of supreme arrogance. It was a once-in-a-lifetime chance to strike a blow that could reverse the entire course of the war, but he had a monumental problem. The troops he needed to launch an attack, the newly formed French Sixth Army under General Marne, were under the direct command of the French commander-in-chief, the methodical General Joffre. Joffre was the very opposite of Gallieni's fiery urgency. He was a large, placid man, methodical and famously unflappable. Throughout the disastrous retreat, he had remained unnervingly calm, quietly absorbing the bad news, sacking incompetent generals, and maintaining focus on the moment he could finally turn and fight. But he was not a man to be rushed into a rash decision. He was planning his own counter-offensive, a massive, coordinated battle further south. It was a safer, more conventional plan designed to be executed once his armies were fully reorganized. And what happened next would become the most famous taxi ride in history. When Gallieni frantically called Joffre's headquarters on September 4th, urging an immediate, all-out attack on the exposed German flank, he was met with caution. Joffre hesitated. An attack now felt premature, risky. His armies were still in retreat, exhausted and disorganized. Could they truly turn and fight effectively? Gallieni was incensed by the delay. In a series of increasingly heated telephone calls, he argued, he pleaded, he demanded action. He famously told Joffre that they were debating while the fate of France was being sealed. To fail to attack now would be a historic crime. Finally, swayed by Gallieni's unshakable logic and the undeniable evidence on the map, Joffre relented. He would cancel his planned offensive. He would seize the fleeting opportunity. The French would stop running. They would turn and fight on the banks of the River Marne. The order was given, a jolt of electricity sent down the lines to every French army. But a new crisis immediately arose. The French Sixth Army was still assembling, its soldiers scattered across the Parisian rail network, and time was running out. To strike with enough force to be decisive, Gallieni needed to move thousands of troops to the front line immediately. There weren't enough trains available. There wasn't enough time. It was in this moment of logistical desperation that Gallieni conceived of his most audacious plan. He would requisition the city's taxi fleet. On the evening of September 7th, an incredible sight unfolded on the broad boulevards of Paris. Police officers, armed with lists and unprecedented authority, fanned out across the city, stopping every taxi they could find. Drivers, baffled and patriotic, were ordered to a central assembly point. A fleet of some 600 taxis was gathered, their meters running the entire time. Each cab could hold 4 or 5 soldiers, their long rifles with fixed bayonets sticking awkwardly out of the windows. All through the night, this strange armada ferried over 5,000 soldiers to the front lines, their headlights cutting a procession through the darkness. For the soldiers, crammed into the small vehicles, it was a bizarre journey to war. For the citizens who watched them go, it was a symbol of total, unified resistance, a moment where the entire nation rose up as one. It was the physical embodiment of the spirit of Paris, a defiant gesture that transformed the mood from one of impending doom to one of fierce, hopeful resolve. But as those taxis rolled toward the front, the German army was walking into a trap they had set for themselves. On the morning of September 6, 1914, the retreating soldiers of France and Britain stopped retreating. They turned. Along a 100-mile front, the exhausted, the beaten, and the broken prepared to throw themselves back into the jaws of the beast that had devoured their country. The order from Joffre had been read to the troops at dawn. It was simple, powerful, and electric. The time for retreat was over. The fate of France hung on the coming battle. Every soldier was to fight and die where they stood rather than give up another foot of ground. For many, it felt like a suicide mission, a final, desperate act of defiance against an invincible foe. But as the first French 75mm field guns began to bark their sharp, distinctive report, something shifted in the air. The momentum of the war, which for a month had belonged entirely to the Germans, began to shudder, slow, and then, with incredible violence, reverse. The first blow fell on the exposed German flank, precisely where Gallieni had predicted. The French Sixth Army, commanded by General Marne and reinforced by the men who arrived in the Parisian taxis, slammed into von Kluck's rearguard corps. The Germans were caught completely by surprise. They had expected to be chasing a broken enemy, not fighting for their lives against a determined, furious assault. Von Kluck reacted immediately. Realizing the grave danger to his rear, he began pulling his other army corps from the south and redirecting them north to face Marne's attack. He was wheeling his entire army around to meet this unexpected threat. But in doing so, he stretched his own lines to the breaking point and widened the gap between his army and von Bülow's Second Army to his east. The gap was now a chasm, a gaping hole in the German line. And into this chasm marched the British Expeditionary Force. For the British Expeditionary Force, this was a moment of profound redemption. After weeks of brutal retreat, they were finally advancing again. Cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, they pushed into the gap, meeting little resistance. They were a dagger aimed at the rear of von Kluck's army and the now exposed flank of von Bülow's. The German command structure began to seize up in panic. Their neat, orderly battle plan had descended into utter chaos. Meanwhile, on the front of the French Fifth Army, now commanded by the fiery General Franchet d'Espèrey, nicknamed Desperate Frankie, the fighting was ferocious. And in the center of the entire Allied line, the French Ninth Army under General Foch faced the greatest crisis. It was here that the battle came closest to being lost. the French forces found themselves holding a critical position against repeated, overwhelming assaults from elements of von Bülow's and von Hausen's German armies, facing odds of nearly 4-1. For days, the French soldiers fought with unimaginable, desperate courage, yielding ground measured in yards, their beloved 75mm guns firing over open sights, their barrels glowing red, to tear bloody holes in the dense waves of advancing Germans. They were outnumbered, outgunned by heavier German artillery, and pushed to the very limits of human endurance, but they refused to break. Their heroic stand was the anchor of the entire Allied line, a pivot of courage that prevented a German breakthrough that would have unraveled the whole counterattack and doomed Paris. The Battle of the Marne was not one single engagement, but 100 desperate, brutal fights spread across a vast landscape. It was a chaotic swirl of French infantry in their bright red trousers and blue coats charging with the bayonet, of British soldiers firing their disciplined mad minute of 15 aimed rifle rounds, and of German machine gunners grimly traversing their weapons to cut down the attackers. It was a battle fought on raw nerve and the absolute refusal to accept defeat. It was in the midst of this chaos that General Foch, his situation apparently hopeless, penned his now immortal message to Joffre. "My center is yielding, my right is in retreat. Situation excellent. I am attacking." This was the spirit of the Marne. The German soldiers, who had marched for weeks on the promise of an easy victory and a parade in Paris, were stunned by the ferocity of the counterattack. They were exhausted, their supply lines were failing, and they were now fighting a determined, resurrected enemy on 3 sides. The psychological shock was immense. The invincible machine was sputtering, breaking down in the face of a will it could not crush. If you find this turning point in history as fascinating as we do, let us know in the comments. Which part of this incredible battle stands out to you the most? We love hearing your thoughts and diving deeper into the history you're passionate about. The German High Command was in disarray. Von Moltke, far from the front, received confused and contradictory reports. To get a clear picture, he sent a trusted intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Hench, to visit the headquarters of his army commanders. What Hench found was chaos and pessimism. Von Bülow was convinced his Second Army was on the verge of collapse. When Hench reached von Kluck's headquarters, he found the general still determined to fight, but it was clear his army was overextended and in grave danger of being cut off. Hench, armed with the authority of the High Command, made the fateful decision. He authorized a retreat. The dream of a quick victory was dead, killed in the fields and marshes along the Marne. The machine was broken. For the first time in the war, the seemingly unstoppable German army was in full retreat. The order, authorized by Lieutenant Colonel Hench and confirmed by a demoralized High Command, rippled across the front on September 9th. The great advance was over. Paris was saved. A miracle had occurred. But on the banks of the River Marne, where the fields were littered with the cost of that miracle, a new and terrible future for the world was just being born. For the Allied soldiers, the sight of the Germans falling back was almost incomprehensible, a vision they had ceased to believe was possible. For over a month, they had seen nothing but the backs of their own comrades as they fled south. Now, they saw the backs of the enemy. The sense of relief was euphoric, intoxicating, a wave of pure joy that washed away weeks of fear and exhaustion. As the news reached the capital, the bells of Paris, which had been silent in fearful anticipation, now rang out in a jubilant, deafening chorus. The miracle on the Marne was hailed as one of the most decisive victories in the history of warfare, a battle that saved France and fundamentally turned the tide of the entire war. But this victory came with a price no one could have imagined. The German retreat was not a rout. Beaten but not broken, their retreat was an orderly, professional withdrawal, their rearguards fighting skillfully to delay the pursuing Allies. They fell back 40 miles to the high ground north of the River Ain, a powerful defensive position with commanding views of the surrounding countryside. And there, they stopped. On the hills and ridges, under the direction of their engineers, they began to dig. They dug trenches, deep defensive positions protected by overlapping fields of machine gun fire and tangled forests of barbed wire. When the pursuing French and British armies arrived, Eager to press their advantage, they found the Germans firmly entrenched, their advance shattered by a wall of steel and lead. The momentum of the Allied counter-attack bled away against this prepared defense. So the Allied soldiers dug in as well, seeking cover from the relentless artillery and the scything fire of the machine guns. What was meant to be a war of movement, of grand, sweeping maneuvers and decisive battles in the open field, had ground to a bloody, muddy halt. This was the birth of the Western Front. From this initial line of trenches on the Aisne, the two sides would launch a series of flanking maneuvers, each trying to get around the other in what became known as the Race to the Sea. But each attempt was blocked, and the line of trenches extended further and further north until it stretched as a single, unbroken scar from the Swiss border to the North Sea. The miracle on the Marne did not end the war. It tragically ensured the war would not end quickly. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's only strategy for a swift victory, was dead and buried in the fields of northern France. Both sides were now locked in a symmetrical conflict of attrition, with neither able to land a decisive blow or outflank the other. The result was a horrific stalemate, a new kind of industrial warfare that would consume the empires of Europe and devour an entire generation of its young men in a senseless meat grinder. The heroism and sacrifice on the Marne had saved the French Republic, an achievement that can never be diminished, but it had condemned the continent to 4 more years of unimaginable slaughter. The trenches they dug that day would become the Western Front, and the next 4 years would prove that sometimes winning a battle means losing much more than you saved. The First World War is filled with these incredible moments where the course of history was changed forever. If you want to see more stories about the battles and decisions that shaped our world, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next.